Okay, 1 Peter chapter 2. Before we jump into chapter 2, you've probably figured this out by now. We got to remember what happened in chapter 1. How many of you were here last week? Okay, chapter 2 starts with this word, therefore. Or some of your versions might say, so. And so when we have the word so or therefore, it's a connection word. It's kind of building a bridge from what happened previously. And so you can flip there if you want, or you can just take my word for it. This is what happened at the end of 1 Peter chapter 1. Peter is developing this argument of who Jesus is, and you might recall that he's writing with this perceived urgency. His urgency is that Jesus could return at any time, and we don't want to be found lacking. We want to be found as people who have submitted ourselves to Jesus, who have been transformed in his image. At the end of chapter 1, he says two things. He says that because of that, one of the things that we have to have in our midst is this brotherly, sisterly, familial love among one another. We have to be able to rally around one another. And you'll recall that Peter is written to a group of people in a far-off place in Turkey, Asia Minor. And they're kind of living out in a pagan island out there. And they're trying to live as faithful followers of Jesus, but it's hard. It's hard to live as a faithful follower of Jesus in a place where your faith is foreign. Your commitment to your faith could be death or violence or a loss of a job or any of these things. And he says the thing that will hold you all together is your faith in Jesus, but also your love for one another. And it has to be real, tangible love. And then he ends chapter 1 by saying the way that that love happens is that we depend on God's word and not our own flesh. You might recall he quotes the scripture and he says, God's word endures forever. The flesh is like a flower of the field. It can be beautiful in seasons, but even the most beautiful flower is going to dry out, turn to dust, and blow away in the wind. So what do you want to depend on, God's word or your flesh? And so chapter 2 begins in this way. And he's talking about how do we love one another with this type of love, a love that is very uncommon, a love that is non-existent and impossible outside of what Jesus has done in and through us. And this is what he says. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. We'll talk about these words in a second, but if you're following the footnotes, I put some Greek definitions there just so we know what the words mean. But I love the word deceit. I had no idea. The word deceit in a slightly different version as a noun is the exact same word as fish bait. Is that interesting? It's fish bait. The idea of deceit is that you would fool a fish into thinking it's one thing, and then when it realizes it's not that thing, you already got him hooked by the mouth. Isn't that fascinating? So the idea of deceit is to trick somebody into thinking that you are something that you're not, and then when they're invested or committed to it, that's when they realize that they've been duped. So he gives us these 5 vices, and I think he gives us these 5 because these 5 are especially detrimental to relationships that would lead us to live out the love that God has called us to live. So it erodes our confidence in one another. It erodes our confidence in some ways. If you can imagine a young church, a church that's maybe 8 or 10 years old. Maybe people are coming to faith, and they're coming into the community, and let's say they start to see things like malice and hypocrisy and envy and slander. A natural human reaction would be to say, well, now I'm questioning who this God is that you guys are all following, because it seems like your actions and your behaviors are not in anything positive. We have a good new friend, Coda, over here playing some awesome toys. So we're all for it. We're all for kids. Have at it. So this is what he's saying. He's saying these things have got to go. Now, this is not an inclusive list. This is just kind of a summary of some of the things that would definitely erode our confidence in one another. It would definitely draw a wedge between us and who God is calling us to be. He goes on and he says, like newborn infants, as they long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. How many of you have had babies around, or you've had your own babies before? So we have Shepherd. Shepherd is almost 4 months old. Time flies. Can you believe he's almost 4 months old? It's crazy. But this is what I was thinking about when I was thinking about spiritual milk. Because babies have this tendency to be like fully asleep Then they get hungry and they just burst awake and freak out. Have you noticed that? And in the ancient world, there is no supermarket that has formula or anything like that. There is one way to nourish a child in the ancient world, and that is mom's milk. And mom's milk does a lot of things. It nourishes a child. It's the way that a child grows strong and bigger. It provides an intimacy. Have you ever watched a child who's breastfeeding look at mom? It's like that is a connection that is not anywhere else present on the planet. It's a place of security and safety, and this is how a baby grows. We're all tracking with the illustration? So Peter says, everybody understands the illustration to be true. This is what God's word is to you. Without it, there is no nourishment, there is no security, there is no intimacy with God. This is the thing that will nourish you into becoming the people that Peter's about to describe that we're supposed to be. And here's the news flash. We talked about it last week. He is dead set on the fact that you and me and all of us are called to be holy as God is holy. It is a very high calling. So he says it's like this. And I was thinking about this because how many of you remember the season or the week or the time that you accepted Jesus to be the Lord of your life? How many of you can remember that? For me, something happened. My life actually didn't change a whole lot, especially early on. Like my family drama was all the same. My friend group was in the process of turning over and me finding new friends. But one huge thing happened. It was, I had no idea what any of this meant, but I used to rush home. I would do my homework, and I would pull out this paperback NLT Bible that somebody gave me at a retreat where I accepted Jesus. They gave me this $5.99, you know, the bulk Bibles that come in the boxes, and there's like 50 of them, and they're just passing them out. It was the NLT translation. And I remember, like, I don't know where to read. I don't know what to do. I don't even know what these things mean. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm just going to start reading it. And I cannot tell you how confused I was. I had no idea who these people were. By the time I got to Leviticus, I was just like, I got no clue. But it didn't matter because every day it was like a magnetic pulse. It was like a moth to a flame. Like there was something about it, like, I don't know what's going on, but like, I just want to read more. And I think I told you not long ago, somebody gifted me a pocket Bible. I started going to this youth group, and one of the leaders gave me this pocket Bible. And the real reason I got the pocket Bible was I was embarrassed that my old friend group might find out that I was so enamored with the Bible that I was going to try to read it at school. So they're like, should we try to correct this young believer, or should we give him a tool that could be the next step? So they gave me a pocket Bible. So I remember doing like this, like posting up against the locker and then pulling the Bible out, checking my 6, and then just reading. But I think this is what Peter is talking about. As a baby just bursts awake and has a one-track, singular, focused mind, this is how a follower of Jesus is supposed to be and supposed to act. How many of you are there right now? Is it any wonder that throughout the scripture it reminds us that we're to return to our first love, that we're supposed to have a childlike faith? I love this. This is a school bus. It's an epic school bus. So this is it. Now, I want to mention one more thing before we move on. I was listening to this sermon a few weeks ago, and it was just in preparation for the series, and so I think the guy's name is David Geisick or Gutzik or something like that. He's a Calvary Chapel preacher. What is it? G-U-Z-I-K. Yeah, G-U-Z-I-K. Yeah. Gusick? Okay. I found him on YouTube. I've watched a couple of his sermons. Really good stuff. But one thing that he said that popped out to me was about this spiritual milk thing. Because he said, even in the ancient world, people knew that if you wanted your body to be strong and powerful, you pretty much needed two things, more or less. You needed nourishment, and you needed exercise of some kind. Does that still ring true today? And so what he says is the first thing Peter tells you is that the nourishment you need is God's word. That's kind of the first half of chapter 2. Then the rest of the entire book of 1 Peter is what is the exercise? And the exercise is living a holy life. And as we pursue God's holiness, he begins to transform us to look like him. And so from here on, we're going to get a little bit of milk, but he's going to start to talk to us about what is the exercise that we do to flex our spiritual muscles. Let's move on. Verse 4. As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in the scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious. And whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and the stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word, and as they were destined to do. Pretty cool image. This is one of those pet peeves of mine in the Bible, because I feel like I have to stop, because if you don't understand a living stone, you can't understand any of that, right? It's not like simple, like, I don't get it, I'm just going to move on. So I get driven crazy sometimes when I have like a morning devotion where I read this, and then I'm like, I was looking for light, easy reading. Now I literally can't move forward until I understand what this means. Anybody ever been there before? You're like just trying to read like a nice little psalm, and then all of a sudden David's like praying to slay his enemies, and you're like, good morning, happy Wednesday. So let's talk about this living stone. What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of a stone? A rock? Okay, a rock? Hard, yeah? Solid? Immovable? Without movement? Permanence? Strength? All those sorts of things. How many of you, the first thing you thought is not living? Okay? So there's like some irony in the image that we're talking about a living stone, which is kind of the epitome of something that's not living, right? The idea of a stone throughout the scriptures is this idea of like permanence and strength. And I think what Peter is doing is he's capitalizing. Now, this is very interesting to me. How many of you were with us for that 3 months that turned into a year and a half of Matthew? Okay, do you remember a couple of these things? Let me remind you. Do you remember this time where Peter is like all fidgety and weird? He doesn't know what's going on. Jesus has entered into Jerusalem. He goes in the temple, and then they come out, and he's sort of like, oh gosh, the guy is flipping tables. He's being crazy. Jesus, look at the stones this place is built with. Do you remember that? He's like, I don't know what to talk. Small talk, small talk. Weather, he's here. He can see the weather. Look at the architecture. And do you remember what Jesus says? Yeah, not one stone will be left upon another at this place, right? I got to imagine as Peter's writing this, he can remember that story. Can you think of anything else stone-related that Peter might be reminded of? Yeah. Jesus said in Matthew 16, you are Peter, which means the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Now, we're not just going to move away from the Bible to the point and forget that that is the guy who wrote these words. So I want us to be thinking about this. Peter is very invested in the imagery because Jesus literally changed his name to that, right? So let's talk about this. He says that, let me flip the page back. A living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. And you yourselves are like living stones. You are being built up in a spiritual house. So the imagery is a first century construction site. It's about building. So let's talk about this for a moment. In the ancient world, what would happen is that people would quarry out stones, and they would be kind of rough hewn, and they would be transported one way or another to the site. So let's just say you're building a temple, which Jesus is talking about a spiritual temple. All of these stones would start to be shown, they'd start to show up, and they'd be stacked in a certain way where they'd be accessible, and then there'd be slave labor and animals and all these things to be able to lift them. Okay? Are we kind of picturing this? Now, there'd be a group of people that would be maybe like contractors, architects. They would begin to examine the stones and decide which ones we're going to use and which ones might be thrown aside. Okay? In the ancient world, a lot of times they needed these stones because, do you remember last week we talked about Nero, who probably lit half of Rome on fire? Earthquakes. Have you ever heard, like, for instance, Rome, they dig down like 10 feet and there's like the old city is just buried under the ground and then they just built another city right on top of it. Oftentimes when this happened, what they would do is they would just fill in the gaps with rejected stones and kind of lay a new foundation of the earth, cover it up, and just start building again. Does that sound like a good idea? It gives a different meaning when Jesus says that the wise man built his house upon a rock, right? So this is the idea. So people would come and they would examine the stones. Now they're looking for a particular stone to get started, and that stone is called the cornerstone. Now the cornerstone is often a large stone, but it doesn't have to be the biggest stone. It has to be the stone that they've decided that they can chisel and they can sand down to be the perfect angle that they want to start with two walls coming together. So this stone is going to be laid. It's going to have extreme attention to detail because every stone in the first two walls is going to follow this template of the angle that this stone lays out. Does that make sense? So this is what Peter says. Jesus is a living stone. He has been rejected by men. So the image is we got all the stones. Jesus' stone is rejected. It's thrown off. It's not necessary in the eyes of the builders. But in the sight of God, it's chosen and it's precious. Okay? So we're going to find out Jesus is the cornerstone. You yourselves are like living stones, and you are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. So the idea is that you are being built into this thing that Jewish converts and even Gentiles alike would recognize the language. You are being built into what? A temple, a place of worship, right? Not a physical building, but spiritually speaking, you are being constructed to be a place. Are you ready for this? In the Jewish world, what is so important about the temple? It's where the presence of God dwells. So the living stone, you are being built into the living temple, which is the place where God's presence dwells. Now we're going to talk about this in a second. But if you are a Jew and you're hearing that Peter is saying that a Gentile who just believes in this guy Jesus now gets to be part of the temple, what is your first thought? I don't think so, right? So this is like kind of fighting words. So he quotes this, "The stone that the builders rejected in God's eyes has become the cornerstone." And this, hi. Do you want to come up here? You can if you want. I want to share drinks, though. I want to do that. I'm very protective. It's like the one thing in my life I don't share. And a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. So let's talk about two things before we move on. Actually, three. The first one is this. You yourselves are stones being built into a spiritual house. This is that you collectively, in some way, shape, or form, are being built into something where God's presence dwells. Is that amazing? Now I want you to remember where this letter is being sent off to. It's being sent off to a far-flung land out in Turkey, Asia Minor, way removed from Jerusalem. You remember that? So this is like geographically removed, and when you're geographically removed this far, there's probably only a handful of, how about it? Here, you want to try this? Yeah. Sing. There's a feeling of disconnect. And Peter says, not only are you not disconnected, but spiritually you're being built into something where God's presence dwells. God's presence doesn't just dwell in Jerusalem. It dwells in a far-flung land in Asia Minor, Turkey, because of who you are, because of what you're being built to become. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to be built. You got a construction site in the ancient world. You got all these stones, and a builder has an idea. They pick out the cornerstone. Peter says the cornerstone is Jesus. Now the rest of the stones need to fall in line with where Jesus' stone has been laid. Now these are not just stones that come from the quarry ready to be laid. These are stones that there are slaves and there are artisans with chisels and all kinds of tools. And what are they going to begin to do? The contractor is going to say, the next stone I need is going to be this dimension. It's going to be this wide, this deep, this long. And so what do the people start to do? I've never felt less cute in my whole life. You guys are looking right past me. You having fun? I'm glad that you're here. So the idea is that there's going to be a chiseling. when you think of a rock and something getting chiseled away, is that like a peaceful, kind process? It's noisy, it's loud, it's violent, right? I was actually looking up on YouTube. There's still places who do this, and I saw a video from Kazakhstan. It's a video you can find on YouTube. Basically, this guy has created little holes in a huge rock. Like I'm going to guess like probably 50 feet wide and probably 20 feet high. And he's created a seam of all these little holes, and he's driving little wedges into it. And he's going down the line 1, 2, 3, and he's coming back down 1, 2, 3. And they're getting like half an inch further. Have you guys seen this? And then all of a sudden, the entire thing just goes, breaks in half. This is the image that you're going to be broken down. You're going to get chiseled away. And the final product is going to be beautiful, but the process to get there might be difficult. Peter is going to say, and we've already talked about it last week, the process is called persecution. And it's not if it happens, it's when it happens. And so that is the process of you becoming the living temple, the living rocks that are being built in a way where God's presence would dwell. It goes on and says that you are a holy priesthood. Now remember, the audience of this letter are Gentiles who have become converts to Christianity. Now, if you're living far off and you accept Jesus, and part of Jesus' heritage is this thing, the Old Testament, the Torah, there's got to be some complex in you that thinks like maybe I'm less than or maybe I'm smaller than these Jewish converts who have a long heritage, who, like me when I first went to college, like I don't know any of this stuff, but all these kids know all of it, right? Then Peter says, you are a holy priesthood. He just calls it out. You are a holy priesthood. You are included. You are part of that identity that previously was only accessible to the Jews. Only the Jews had accessibility to God's presence in the temple. But now the temple is you, plural, collectively being built into this thing. It's very beautiful. The last thing that's very interesting is this. He says, the stone that the builders rejected has become a stumbling block, the rock of offense. I think this is what Peter is saying. If you recognize Jesus as the Lord, you look at him and you recognize my whole life falls in line with that angle. But if you don't know him and you start to learn about him, what do people who maybe don't know anything about Jesus, what is their understanding of who Jesus is? What do they say about him? He's a good man. How about in this culture? What do people think about Jesus and the people who follow him? Jesus freaks, old-fashioned, rigid, right? Intolerant, all of these things. And I think Jesus becomes a stumbling block because, listen, there are people who are claiming he's the Savior, he's the Messiah, he's the Lord of the entire heavens and the earth. And if you don't believe that, you get angry, you get upset, you see him as an issue to living the life that you want to live, right? He has constraints and restrictions, and I would never follow a guy like that. And he becomes a stumbling block. I'm going to turn the page here. This is verse 9. And then we're going to pause after this chunk and we're going to have a little table discussion. But you are a chosen race. Now I want to preface this chunk. Peter knows what he's saying because Peter grew up Jewish. Do you remember that? To the best of your ability, I know we're in different places of understanding, but do the very best you can to just think of everything I know about Old Testament Jewish culture, Jewish people, Jewish language, their understanding of who Jesus was, all of that. And now listen to these words that Peter writes to Gentiles in Asia Minor. You are a chosen race. Amen. You are a royal priesthood. Now I want to pause before I forget this. Do you remember in ancient Israel there is a king and there is a high priest? Do you remember this? And they are two very distinct, separate things on purpose. And in some ways, the high priest and the prophet and the king, they're supposed to work in tandem to hold each other accountable, but clearly that doesn't always happen. Peter combines the two and says, you are a royal priesthood. Your royal blood comes because of your connection to the real king, who is Jesus. Outside of Jesus, there's nothing royal about you, but those who belong to him, we're talking to a whole bunch of royal people here. You tracking? Not only are you royal because you belong to the king, but you are a priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. Who is that describing? If we're thinking of it like just face value, if you just read that outside of, you don't know where that came from, it just came from the Bible, who is the first thing you think of that's describing? The Jews. So what is Peter saying? Are we all Jews? We're all adopted into this new thing. It's more inclusive than ever, and the only marker for whether you're in or you're out is this. Is Jesus the Messiah? Is he who he says he is? In him, is there really freedom from sin and death, or is there not? That's it. Doesn't matter if you're Gentile, if you're Jewish, if you're a Samaritan, the most despised person, you believe in Jesus, you're part of the royal priesthood. This is what Peter is saying. It is fully inclusive to anyone who has faith in Jesus. It's no longer simply, are you born Jewish? Are you circumcised? Do you know the Torah? And he says, listen, you are all of those things. This is very important because I think this is kind of the pivot point to what we were talking about, going from spiritual milk to now we got to exercise to have our nourishment and now build up the muscles, the spiritual muscles. So why are you a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession? That you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. What is the purpose of you being adopted? It's not just that I have security, I'm going to heaven when I die. How many of you are very much looking forward to heaven? It's not just that. Remember we talked about this in 1 Peter. There is a hope for the future, but there's a hope now. Oh, dude, this right here. This is like, these people know, this is like my thing. I have one a day or else I go crazy, so this is all I'm going to get. Yeah. No, you can have that. I don't mind sharing that at all. So the whole point of all of it is that you would proclaim, and I think Peter is going to say this, there is definitely a place for you to proclaim with your words that Jesus is the Lord, but Peter is mostly worried about who are you becoming? How does your life look? Are you holy? Are you subjecting yourself to the authority of God and becoming like him? Because if you do, people are going to look in on you and they're going to see something different about you. So he says you're going to proclaim, I would say primarily you're going to proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness, and you're going to do it with your whole life. It's going to be natural. Once you were not a people. That's very exclusive, isn't it? He's literally saying that under the understanding of the Old Testament, you literally were not even considered a real people group. But now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. So there's an identity now. The person you belong to dictates all of these things. And who do you belong to? You belong to the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and he's adopted you. So I think this is what Peter wants them to know, that even in your acceptance of Jesus and you've put your faith in him, I think he would say, I want you to know this. You are not second-class citizens. You're not lucky to get a seat at the table. You're not like some minority political group and you're like, oh, finally we got a seat in parliament. No. You are seated at the table because of who Jesus is and your faith in him. You're not lucky to be there. But you are one part, but we are all one people of God through Jesus. So there's a question number one. Just curious, we're not going to have time for everybody to share in depth, so why don't we just pick a couple people who want to share? We'll do another question in a little while, so maybe people who don't share right off the bat can share that one. But here's the question. How do you proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness and into marvelous light? And then here's kind of the follow-up question. In what circumstances do you thrive? Like, here I am. Here's Jesus in me. And in what circumstances do you maybe find yourself shrinking back or maybe keeping that hidden a little bit? Before class, Chester was saying he had some issues feeling like super nervous about public speaking, so his personality was, in college, he just signed himself up. Like, as soon as I sign myself up, I'm going to be obligated, I'm going to get over it. And he said in the very first class, the professor said, I want everyone to stand up, introduce yourself. And what was it, Chester? The most important thing to you. And he said there was this burning feeling like, what am I supposed to say? I want to say Jesus. I want to say Jesus. Should I say Jesus? And he said Jesus. And what did the professor say? How about something else?
Well, the next 6 people said God, too.
Oh.
And so then the professor got tired of
At UCLA, they all said that.
No, it wasn't UCLA.
Oh.
It was at OCC.
College has changed quite a bit. I'm going to go out on a limb and say 6 people in a row and no college in America say Jesus is the number one thing. So where do you find yourself thinking, like, should I share that? Should I be my Christian self? Should I just be quiet and kind of like blend in? Where do you thrive? Where do you find yourself kind of shrinking back? So I'm going to turn some music on. We'll give ourselves 3 or 4 minutes to chat, and then I'd like to hear 1 or 2 people on that microphone if I can find it. Ready, set, go.
So my mom actually said something that I think really resonated at our table, which is that every time my mom gets put in a situation of meeting someone brand new, she always asks the Lord, like, God, you put this person in my path. Like, what is your desire for me in this encounter? Like, but the notion that if we really believe that nothing in our lives, because we're Christians, is an accident, that God has purpose in everything that he puts in our path, it totally changes the way that we look at those encounters, because it gives us a sense of purpose and responsibility and intentionality of being a light in that person's life, no matter whether it's at the grocery store or car dealership or at the park. But if we really truly believe that those encounters are just random and circumstantial, then maybe that's why we don't put any value in those relationships, because they seem so superficial or so trivial or not important. But I think if we can look at our lives as that God has given us all our own sphere of influence, our own place in life where only we can fulfill that role, because there is no one else that's going to be in your time and space with you. You're an individual. And so if those things that we encounter are not accidents, then we have an opportunity to share God's love in a multitude of ways. I mean, it could just be opening the door for someone. It could be asking them how their day is. It could be there's so many ways of doing it. And my mom just gave an example where she was, in her driveway and someone had moved in next to her and they were outside, and my mom felt like God wanted her to say something, and she just said, "Yeah, I'm just so glad that you're my neighbor and that you've moved in, and we've lived here a very long time and we love the Lord, and if there's anything we could ever do to bless you, we would love to do that." And the guy started to cry. But again, like, that could have just, if you just took that encounter as just a random, non-purposeful event, you would never have had the opportunity to say something so small but yet so profound in someone's life that they would cry. You know what I mean? Like, and I think that's the hardest part about living as a Christian, is to live with intentionality everywhere that we go.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I love that you can just turn it off. We'll just leave it there. I love that your example is it's spirit-led. There's not a formula of this is how I talk to strangers, right? I think sometimes people are turned off by Christian evangelism because oftentimes it becomes like a program, and here is the way. This is what you do. Here is the step-by-step. And it sounds like from what you're saying is what your mom does is every single person is a different thing. And it takes a prayer, it takes a connection with the Spirit to say, what would speak to this person's heart? I think, I'm not like trying to be funny, like that's the right answer, isn't it? It's the hard answer, because I think as humans we want to know, like, what's expected of me, or what do I do when, right? How many of you are like very mathematical in mind? Like, I want to know what I'm supposed to do and when, and then I'll just do that. I think one thing I've noticed is a lot of times people in crisis especially, they want to come in and they want to be told, this is what you need to do. Here's step 1, step 2, and step 3, and then you'll be out. You know who does that really well? The books for dummies that you buy at Barnes & Noble, right? Sometimes people get frustrated with, let's pursue the Lord. Well, he's not speaking quick enough. How many of you have had that? Like, I just want an answer right now. He's not. I think that's the Christian life, is we're going to wait, and sometimes the timing doesn't make sense. Sometimes what God calls us to doesn't make sense. Sometimes it makes so much sense we're like, why didn't we think of that, right? My experience tells me that oftentimes God uses the gifts he's already put in you, and those are opportunities to kind of lift weights with it a little bit as we're talking about today. Thank you for sharing that. We're going to move on to verse 11. We got to get you a lazy boy or something. You can just pull it back. Beloved. By the way, this word right here, beloved, is one of the reasons that scholars are very sure that at some point, and we talked about this last week, we don't know when, Peter has a familial relationship with these people, and it is not clear, when did Peter go there? When was he part of planning these churches? It's one of those fascinating historical questions that we just don't know the answer to. But just this word right here is this relational word that like we know each other, which is just an interesting concept. So, beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. Do you remember that word from last week? The idea is that you are just passing through. This is not your permanent residence. You are passing along and you're going elsewhere, but for the time being, this is where you find yourself. So I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. How many of you have heard this verse before? That they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Now I want to just bring something to life, because I was chatting with Danny today, and I was reading a commentary, and it said something very convicting to me. And this is more or less what it says. It said that in our current context, kind of think just like the Western world in the last few decades, we live in a world where we're kind of obsessed with passing the buck when responsibility comes our way. Have you noticed that? Anybody ever been on hold like at a call center? You always get somebody like, I'm not trying to be mean, but you always get like the lowest level person, and they're like reading the script. Hello, Mr. Franks, how are you today? And you're like, oh gosh, can I talk to your supervisor? And you get that person, they're like, yeah, we're not really sure, we're really sorry, can you please hold? And they just put you on a series of holds, I think with the intention just to get you to hang up because they don't want to deal with it. Have you ever had that experience before? And usually it's like in a different time zone and all these sorts of things. And so we're obsessed with passing the buck. And so what I was reading was this theological tendency in us to say this. You know, when it comes to Christianity, don't look at me. Look at Jesus. How many of you have heard that before? Don't look at me. Look at Jesus. You heard this before? If you haven't heard it, do you understand the sentiment in it? And I think that there's maybe some good in that. It's, of course, you shouldn't look at us for the perfection of faith. We shouldn't be the thing that you look at and think like, that is what Christian faith is. How many of you would say that you are prone to sin from time to time? Yeah, we are. In the ancient world, there is zero, and I mean zero concept of don't look at me, look at Jesus, because the idea of holiness and being called into holiness gives Paul the power and the freedom to say, as I follow Jesus, you follow me. He's not saying I'm perfect or I'm going to do it perfectly. He's saying if you follow me, you will see Jesus in me, and I am confident of it. It's not arrogant or prideful to say so. It's that God has changed my heart, and if you hang out with me, you will get a glimpse of him. And we read that in our culture, and we think what? Pride, arrogance. Does that make sense? And so we come up with these ideas of like, don't look at me, look at Jesus. But what we're doing is we're passing the buck and we're saying, don't expect much out of me as far as Christian character is concerned. I'm just a sinful person who's prone to sinfulness. I like you, man. You're going to take stuff apart, I think. So here's the idea. That first century Christians, and here's the real reason why. In the first century, it doesn't matter where Christianity is on planet Earth, the stakes are extremely high. You going to put your guitar on there? Don't hit anyone with it. It's for a guitar. Because here's the thing. You should write this down. You cannot be a Christian in the first century without knowing what the cost is. There is no such thing as safety and security in Christian faith on earth in the first century. To say, yes, I believe in Jesus as my Lord and Savior, I would say that the litmus test is this. On one side, would I be okay if they crucified me upside down? Would I be okay if they beheaded me? Would I be okay if the government forcefully took everything I own and said it's theirs now because of my faith? Am I okay with that? If that's on one side of the scale and you say, I'm totally okay with that, I'm a follower of Jesus, how all in are you? You are super all in. And so the idea of don't look at me, I just go to church every now and then. The idea of the Bible is you can look at me because I'm willing to put it all on the line. I'm willing to put all the chips in the middle because God is making me a person that is marked by holiness. And I think that's what Peter's saying. He's saying, keep your conduct among the Gentiles. So who is he talking about? Literally everyone in the entire world except the people he's writing to. Every time you go to the market or every time you go to the mechanic in this world, every time you do anything, you're surrounded by these people. This is what you're supposed to do. Keep your conduct honorable so that when they speak against you as evildoers, those stupid followers of Jesus, they're ruining everything. Don't they know that we have a temple to the god Saturn? They don't even worship. No wonder it's not raining, right? They're not doing their sacrifices to the rain god. They will see your good deeds. Not that they will hear your good theology that's all put together perfectly. They're going to see you in action. They're going to see you like literally in action. This is what I do. This is how I act. And they're going to glorify God on the day of visitation. Very powerful words. Convicting words. I wrote this. I think I made it to your outline. This is actually from the 8th century, but when you get closer to like the 6th, 7th century in Christian history, all of a sudden like it just opens up and there's tons of things to read and things that have been preserved. This is from a guy who's known as the Venerable Bede. How many of you, when you die like 1,200 years from now, you want to be known as like the Venerable Kevin? High unholy praise. To be honest, I don't know exactly what he did to earn the nickname, but cool nickname. This is what he wrote. It often happens that pagans who once reviled and sneered at the faith of the Christians because they had abandoned their many gods. So he's saying the Christians had abandoned all the gods of the pagans, and so they get sneered at. They stopped doing so after witnessing what a holy and pure life they lead in the one they call the Christ. So they sneer and they talk smack all about those Christians, but when they get to know one, they stop, right? I can't remember the exact context of it, but there was a time when hunger and famine had hit the Roman Empire. There was a lot of sickness, and a lot of Romans with money moved out of Rome to get away from the disease and the sickness. And there's a quotation when the emperor says, like, what should we do? These people say, we're not sure what to do, but we feel like you should just turn over all the care of these people to the Christians because they seem to know what to do. These are people who are like literally being massacred and killed in the streets for their faith. And then when it hits the fan, they're like, we don't know what to do. Let the Christians do it. They seem to know what they're doing. That's the idea. Verse 13. There's a question for you if you'd like to answer that in your own time. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. I'll let that sink in a bit. Yikes. So he's going to go into this. He's going to go into this argument about submission. I think it's actually wise. I'm going to read it. Just take inventory of what your visceral reaction is to these words. Are you ready? Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. What's your reaction? How many of your reaction is, I don't want to? I see you. It's the one thing. When I finish, you can have the can, if it's okay with your mom. What's your reaction? How many of you love the idea of submit and honor the emperor?
Tea party.
All right. The Boston one?
Yeah, the Boston Tea Party.
Toss it in. Okay. Anybody else? What's your reaction?
Why that guy?
Why that guy? Hey, we learned about this guy. He's literally saying the emperor. This is the word for who? Nero, who ended up doing what? Lopping off Paul's head and crucifying Peter upside down. Right? And he's saying, honor him. Yikes. I think here's the reality. Peter knows that he is talking to a tiny fraction of people in a very large area. He's a realist, but he also knows that God is shaping something in you. And if we're going to be like Christ, what is the marker of Christ's submission to the authorities? What did they do to him when he submitted himself to them? They crucified him. For Peter, our lifelong goal on earth with the hope of heaven is that we submit ourselves to God, and in him we have so much hope. Can you say hope? Can you say hope? Yeah, you can. You don't have to say it out loud. We have hope, but our hope is in submitting ourselves to God, and he's going to make us holy. He's going to make us like him. But we get really uncomfortable with, if we're going to be made like him, we want that just to be like in the spiritual sense, not the real sense. So we hear things like, pick up your cross and follow me. And what's the first thing we do? We spiritualize it. I'm just getting a picture of you tying my shoelaces together and me going down. Boom. I think you're too young to learn that one. So here's the thing. Yeah, I just told him. We are to be submitted. It's not because it's good. It's because God called us to it. Can people act violently towards us? Can you get fired from your job? Can you lose friendships? Yes. The idea is not like this is going to be like perfect for your prospering and happiness, because in the first century world, they have zero concept of Christianity as a thing of comfort or security or safety or luxury. It's the exact opposite of that. That's what Christianity comes out of. It comes out of an absolute faith in Jesus that I want to be like him. And if that means I have to be like him in the sense that I will be put to death for my faith, I have to submit myself to people who want to harm me, so be it. You know the word the martyrs? Do you remember Stephen in the book of Acts? He's being stoned to death. You recall this? And he says the exact same words of Jesus. What does he say? Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. What has he done? He submitted himself to them. They have acted violently to the nth degree. And what does he do? He doesn't give in to resentment or anger. He has submitted himself so fully to God that Jesus' words come out of him. Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing to me. So here's I think here's an important concept to think of. Is there a bold section that says like the hierarchy of honor, love, and fear? This is not my idea. I read this week and I thought, oh, that's actually very nice to kind of put it into this concept. So notice that there's four people groups in verse 17. It says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the emperor. Do you see how honor the emperor and honor everyone are like the bookends in this sandwich of honor, love, and fear? So who are you to love? Or I'm sorry, who are you to honor? Everyone, including who? The emperor. Does the emperor have some special status in your mind? No. He's just like everyone else. And you are to honor everyone. Why do we honor everyone? Because we recognize what? What? They're made in God's image. And if you recognize everyone made in God's image, even somebody who's looking at you in the eyes and wishes evil upon you, you can say, you wish evil upon me, you're going to stone me to death. I see God's image in you. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, I'm going to proclaim that I see God's image in you. Even if you don't accept it, that's what I'm going to say. Right? So who is worthy of honor? Everyone. Okay? And the emperor is not, he's not some special case. But there are a special case because he says this. Love the brotherhood. Now, in kind of ancient Greek thought, these three things are a definite hierarchy. So the idea is that everyone is worthy of honor. Then there is a select group worthy of what? Love. And the concept is this. They are worthy of honor and they are worthy of love. And who are they? The brotherhood. And who is the brotherhood? Fellow believers. They're all the other living stones that are being built up into this special thing, right? What? You're a pretty handsome dude. The brothers, the sisters, those who have proclaimed Jesus as their Savior are worthy of honor, and they're also worthy of love. Who is worthy of fear? God and God alone. Is God worthy of honor? Is God worthy of love? Why is God worthy of fear? We touched on it really briefly last week. What's that?
Well, is that word fear the same as it is in other places where it's awesome respect?
Yeah. It's like the utmost reverence, right? I heard it this way in a definition that I said last week. The reason that you have utmost reverence and respect and fear of God is because God is the one who has defined judgment and what is good and what is evil, and you will be subject to those definitions. He holds the keys to you standing before him on the final day and answering for who you are and what you have done. Have you been covered by the blood of Jesus or not? Have you given in to the flesh, or have you repented of that and God has washed you of that? The reason we fear God is because he gets to define that, and you will be judged not by everyone else, not by the emperor. Even when he has a sword up against your neck, he can't judge you, which is why you can say, I can see God's image of you in you right as he lops it off, which is Paul. Or I can see God's image in you. I don't want to be killed like Jesus. I'm not worthy. Can you at least do me the honor and crucify me upside down? That's the story of Peter. I can see God's image in you. I can see God's image in you. And he says the reason you do this is because you will put to silence the ignorant and the foolish. How many ignorant and foolish people can you think of? I was thinking about this. One of my pet peeves in modern Christian faith is that when the mainstream media wants a Christian voice, they always find the most obscure people that speak for all of us. Have you noticed that? Like Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, it doesn't really matter. They're like, oh, weighing in on this big cultural issue is this pastor. And you're like, why does that person get to speak for all of us? So here's what I'm getting at, is that people believe things about Christianity, and I think this is what Peter is saying. Oftentimes they are ignorant and they are foolish. They don't actually know what they're talking about, and what they say is foolish and dumb, and it's not based in fact, right? And the way that you reveal this in them is that you live out what true love and honor and respect and fear of God looks like. So that when they say things that are ignorant and foolish, you can just say, you don't really need my words. Why don't you just take a look at my life and let that be a testimony to what Christians are really like. It's kind of like the quote we read, that as Christians live out who they really are, we start to just correct the narrative on its own. I'm prone to sin. I also am covered by God's grace. I repent often, and I am being made holy in the image of God. And you're in God's image too, and you could start submitting yourself to him. Let's see. I think we have time for this question. So why don't we pause? Here is question number 3. And I want to just give a little pretext before this. Because I think when we talk about theological things like submitting to the government, which how many of you are like, ugh, submitting to the government? And it doesn't really matter your politics. I think every Christian's like, ugh. We have to take the Bible as a whole. We can't just say like whatever 1 Peter chapter 2 says exactly, because the Bible builds on itself, it nuances itself, it looks in from different angles, and it creates what we call a biblical theology, not just a 1 Peter chapter 2 theology. The Bible as a whole would say that yes, we should definitely submit to the authorities. Does the Bible leave room for there are times where we say, whatever the authorities say, I'm choosing to disobey in this moment? So that is kind of what the question is. How do we submit to the governing authorities in our own lives? So how do you do that? And where do you draw the line between submitting to the authorities and choosing to disobey authority for the sake of your faith? Let's be reasonable with one another. There's some different thoughts and beliefs in the room, so let's not be like contentious and overly political, but ready, set, go. I hope that was enriching. Thought-provoking in some ways. I think more than anything, I think it's just an opportunity to reflect on this is what God's word says. It's the rock that is not going to move. It is the stable force that is eternal. Peter has already said, what do you want to base your life on? Your own flesh and your own instincts that are like the flower of the field, or God's word that endures forever? And so I think sometimes we have to hold it up and say, like, where does my life fit well? What has God done in me? And where do I maybe need to revisit some of my instincts or my opinions and things? So I want to push forward because we're going to be short on time, and there is a contentious subject here. I don't want to try to brush over it, but for the sake of time, I'm going to have to move quickly. So verse 18 says this. By the way, this last chunk that we're talking about, subjecting yourself to the institutions and the government, I think Peter is starting by your life of holiness. The first place it should be evident is publicly. So he's talking about submitting yourself publicly to all of these things. And now he's going to say that your life of holiness should be the same behind a closed door. And now he's going to talk about the home. So what I want to tell you is in the first century, the Roman household, the Roman home, Peter does not show a huge interest in trying to reform the system. I think the purpose of Peter's letter is to encourage people who are living in Asia Minor. So sometimes we read the Bible and we're like, oh, the Bible condones slavery. That's what we're going to read. I want to push back. I do not think for a second Peter condones slavery. I think Peter is writing to people who live in these circumstances, and he literally writes 5 chapters. His whole purpose is to encourage and direct these believers, not to try to say, like, this is how you become a revolutionary and overthrow the government. So, just so you know, servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it when you sin and you are beaten for it and you endure? But if when you do a good and suffer for it, you endure, that is the gracious thing in the sight of God. So here's the idea. We talked about this back in Matthew. Probably somewhere between 40 and 60% of the entire Roman Empire are slaves or day laboring servants. A huge, huge portion. And just important because sometimes we kind of like come up with images in our mind. Slavery in the Roman world was not race-based at all. Slavery was an economic decision for most people. And the other huge portion of the slave trade in Rome was conquered people who refused to submit to the Roman authorities. So it's not racial, it's class-based, almost 100%. And a lot of times people would sell themselves into slavery because they couldn't find work, they couldn't provide for their own family, so they decide, I'll work with no wage because at least a master will feed me. Does that make sense? And so this is how the Roman household is just set up. And this is what Peter says. He gives two examples. He says, you should subject or submit yourself to your master with all respect. And then he says this, there's 2 types of suffering. The first one is, I think, a common example in the ancient world. You do something that you totally know you're not supposed to do, and then you're beaten for it. And no matter what you think about spanking, in the ancient world, this is just how the world works. Does everybody understand that? So I'm not telling you my opinion, I'm just telling you this is how the ancient world works. So you do something that's clearly wrong and incorrect, and you are beaten for it. That is the laid out punishment. You are punished for what you've done. Peter says that doesn't really build any character in you, because that's the expectation. That's just how the world works. You're just living how the world works. What does shape you is when you are punished unjustly for doing something. Let's see. Let's make sure I read it exactly. One endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Moving on. But if when you do good, and this word to do good, he's talking about something that is of the character of God. So you're doing something that God is shaping in you. You're seeing the image of God in someone else, and you're treating them that way, and then you're punished for it. He says, when you do good and you suffer for it, you endure. This is a gracious thing in the eyes of God. It's gracious and good in the eyes of God because it looks an awful lot like someone else who subjected themselves and was beaten and crucified, all the while doing the most perfect thing possible. it begins to look like Jesus. So if you do something good and right in the eyes of God and you're punished for that, you are beginning to taste the endurance and pain that Jesus tasted. That is what Peter is saying. I want to revisit something really quickly. Peter is writing these words as a wise older man. There was a time when Jesus was enduring the pain and the endurance of what it meant to follow God, even in the face of the most extreme adversity, and Peter wanted nothing to do with it. Do you remember that? There was a time when Jesus literally tells Peter, hey, this is what's coming for me. They're coming for me. And what does he say? Never. I'm never letting that happen. Do you? And what does Jesus say? Get behind me, Satan, right? Peter has a penchant, I think like all of us, to avoid pain, to avoid suffering, to think, Jesus, I want to ride you all the way to the throne in Rome, and I want to sit on the government. I want your power. I want the miraculous stuff. I want to see all the good stuff. As soon as pain and suffering come, no way. And when it literally comes right to you and it's happening in front of you, what is Peter's first reaction? Lop off a dude's ear, right? You think he was aiming for the ear? No. He stinks at everything, including chopping heads off. That's the point of Peter. So this is what Peter says. Okay, verse 21, this is where we're going to wrap up tonight. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example. Okay, I want to point out this footnote. I read this and I was like, what? There's no way this is true. This is amazing. This is why you study the Bible and you find these nuggets that are like mind-blowing. This is a German Bible scholar, and he basically did a deep dive on this word in Greek, example. And the word is the exact same word that describes the model that Hebrew children would use to trace their letters. It's the exact same word that a Hebrew child would sit and they would look at a model and they would write their Hebrew letters. So here's what he says. As children learn to write by following an existing pattern, not patter, so believers are to trace the pattern of Christ in their lives in order to fully realize their call to holiness. Isn't that cool? It's this imagery of a child just tracing. And you just begin tracing. What does it look to be like Jesus in your spiritual life? And you do that, Jesus leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Verse 22, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. He never even spoke out in resentment or anger or vitriol while they were doing these things to him. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sin in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of your soul. Here's the deal. For Peter, there's no question that a Christian will suffer. In the first century, there's no question. Just to become a Christian is literally asking to suffer. It is, I believe so wholeheartedly in Jesus, I'm willing to put a stake in my whole life in him, even in the face of persecution and suffering. I think, if you want to write this down, this is what I think the question Peter is saying. It's not will you suffer, but will your faith in God and your trust in his love, your trust in his hope, will that be strong enough to keep you following him anyway? By the way, there's really good evidence that a lot of people Peter is writing to are slaves and very lower class people. So I think a lot of what he's saying is not just hypothetical, hey, servants, submit yourselves to your masters. He's literally saying you, the people I'm writing to, if you want to be like Jesus, submit yourself in your employment. I think the second thing we see in Jesus is this, and it's maybe something that we could take home with us, that when we run into persecution of all kinds, I think there's a natural human reaction, and I think Peter lists it. We want to have resentment. There's vitriol. There's a desire for revenge. One of the deepest psychological pieces of a child is revenge. Did you know that? We talked about this a handful of weeks ago. Every child at a certain age already knows in all the languages across the lands, that's not fair, right? They all say that. There's this deep piece of us that in our sin we want to act in anger, revenge, we want to get back at people. And Peter just listed at all the opportunities with all the power of God in him. Jesus refused to do it. Instead, he made a conscious choice to submit himself to God. And then finally, Peter says, Jesus bore our sins unjustly. And when we encounter persecution and unjust treatment, all we can do is, remember 1 Peter chapter 1, we can reframe it to say, this is an opportunity for me to test my faith to see where it stands. So let me pray for you, and then we're going to wrap up for the night. God, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you even for Coda tonight, who brought a laugh and a smile to us. Thank you that your word is alive. And thank you that because of it, we come to find out that you love us with an unfailing love. That you bore the ultimate shame and scorn on the cross because you loved us dearly and you wanted to purchase us back as your own. So we recognize today that we are the living stones. You are building us up into the holy temple. Would we recognize ourselves as made in your image, that the Holy Spirit dwells in us? Would you give us eyes to see every circumstance as an opportunity to extend your hope and your love in the world? So God, as we walk out as lights in a dark place, we pray that that our light would shine bright, that we wouldn't shrink back. We wouldn't allow the world to put our light out, but it would only burn brighter and brighter. So we love you. Thank you for this chance to study your word together. Amen. Amen. Hey, thanks for joining us tonight. Next week, 1 Peter chapter 3.